Member for Markham Unionville.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to pursue some of the themes pursued by my colleague in a somewhat different way. One of the things I've noticed in the debate today, and I've listened to Conservatives and NDPers, is a kind of triumphalist tone that everything about the Canadian banking system, everything about the Canadian economy is not only wonderful, but every job created has to be because of their economic action plan. And no job loss has anything to do with their policies. And as my colleagues pointed out, this is totally ridiculous. As he pointed out, do the Conservatives really believe that they are responsible for the oil and the minerals in the ground and the high commodity prices around the world today? Obviously not. Do the Conservatives really believe that it is they who are responsible for the strong fiscal position which they inherited and in large measure squandered? Evidently not. And the third area, and here's where I will focus the rest of my remarks, is the banking system. Et je pense que je peux dire...
I think that I can say something about the banking system because I worked in the banking industry. I was involved in the debate on bank mergers. And I think that I am in a position to say that Canadian banks today are part of a robust system. It isn't because of the Conservative governments or the Conservative Party's measures, though. On the contrary, the reason that Canada's banking system is strong is in spite of the Conservative policies and not because of them. I can talk about three areas that demonstrate this.
Of bank regulation. Now, as you know, Mr. Speaker, in the 1990s, there was a strong trend toward bank deregulation, both south of the border and in the United States. And the Liberal government of the day in the 1990s and the early 2000s resisted that temptation to go the route of deregulation. Now, it may be true, as my colleague from Winnipeg Centre pointed out, that Tom d'Aquino wanted to go that route. But Tom d'Aquino is not the government. The government was a majority Liberal government, and the Liberal government of the day decided not to go that route, notwithstanding the statements by Tom d'Aquino or by certain Reform Party politicians. So that's the first point, because there's a consensus view that the 2008-9 global financial crisis was in large measure the result of this deregulation, this idea that we now know to be false, that you just allow the banks to regulate themselves and everything will be okay. Well, Canada said no to that under the Liberals. US and UK said yes, and that is a big part of the explanation of why we are where we are. La deuxième question, c'est...
The second issue is bank mergers. I can admit that when I was the chief economist of the Royal Bank, and I was in favor of the proposed merger. I had to be in favor because if I wanted to stay in my position, I had to be.
In favor of bank mergers because at that time I had been persuaded in the late 1990s that the benefits of bank mergers were greater than the costs, so I was in favor of it. So at that point, before I went into politics, I was aligned with the Reform Party, which was pushing for bank mergers, with the banks who were pushing for bank mergers, and no doubt with Mr. Tom d'Aquino, who was pushing for bank mergers. Or perhaps he wasn't because he had to play both sides of the banking field. I don't remember that. But in any event, that's how it was. Then flash forward 10 years, and we have the global financial crisis. And I realized at that point that I had been wrong. That the fact that Mr. Chrétien said no to bank mergers was the right decision. But I only realized that after the world financial crisis. And the reason is I can think back to when I was at Royal Bank, to the mentality of the day within the bank, and the mentality was we want to grow up fast, we want to kick global butt, we want to grow up to be like Citibank or Citigroup. And you saw what happened to them. So with having observed the financial crisis, I became completely converted to the view that Mr. Chrétien was right, bank mergers were bad for Canada, and it was in spite of the Reform Party, not because of them, that Canada said no to bank mergers. So all I would add to that, Mr. Speaker, is that if I can admit now that I was wrong and that the government was right about bank mergers, perhaps the government, someone representing the government, could stand up one day and make a similar admission that they were wrong back then to advocate bank mergers, and what Mr. Chrétien did was the right decision. Finally, I come to mortgages. And here we have a more modern and more recent example of this government's, this current government's, tendency to favor deregulation. Because what did they do in 2006, soon after being elected? Before they were elected, under Liberal governments, the rules for mortgages were that it had to be no longer than for 25 years, and you had to have at least a 5% down payment. And what did these Conservatives do? They went from 25 years to 40 years. And they went from a minimum down payment of 5% to zero. Imagine, this is like U.S. subprime mortgages, 40 years with zero down payment. That's what they did in 2006. So essentially, it's like deregulating mortgages, just as they wanted to deregulate banking. And, Mr. Speaker, I think this is potentially a very bad and risky decision, because if you go back to 2006-8, you find that no less than 60% of first-time home buyers took advantage of these rules and had a 40-year mortgage. So now that we have this high level of debt, now that we have talk of a housing bubble possibly bursting, people who took out those 40-year mortgages with zero down payment, thanks to the actions of this government in 2006, may be seriously at risk. Now, Mr. Speaker, we don't know if this housing bubble is going to burst. You never know if a bubble is going to burst, or even if it's a bubble, until after it has burst. But no less a magazine than The Economist magazine has suggested that Canada is first among countries for eligibility to a bursting bubble. They've pointed out that Vancouver has the highest ratio of house prices to income anywhere in the English-speaking world. And then on the other hand, CMHC comes out with a rosy projection that house prices will continue to rise over the next 2 years. So we don't know, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, whether this will come to pass, but we can say, based on our knowledge of history, based on what we see in other countries, that there is a risk. And what I would say is that if it does come to pass, if we do have a bursting housing bubble, if we do see banks having major losses, and we do see Canadians suffering because of major foreclosures, then a part of the reason for this will have been that decision taken by this Conservative government in 2006 to allow 40-year mortgages with zero down payment. And if that comes to pass, Mr. Speaker, I think Canadians will legitimately lay part of the blame for that at the feet of this government. Donc, en conclusion,
In conclusion, what I have said essentially is that yes, Canada is in a relatively strong situation, but not completely strong. And this good situation does not have anything to do with the government's policies, this government's policy, but rather the decisions made by the Liberal government in the 1990s, and in particular with respect to mortgages. It was not, the mergers were not a way to